there, everyone. My name is Arman Gill, and for those who don't know me, I'm a research student studying about the Canadian criminal justice system, specifically the many problems it has in addressing the overrepresentation of Indigenous people. This TED Talk also features Sircon and Grayson. In this TED Talk, we'll be presenting a sensitive topic which needs to be addressed within the Canadian criminal justice system, that being the overrepresentation of Indigenous people. As we know, Indigenous people have faced a lot of racism, discrimination, and hatred in Canada for a very long time. But even within the Canadian justice system, Indigenous people are discriminated on a regular basis. Going in more depth, I will hand it off to Professor Gamsis, who is specializing in First Nations law and protection rights of the Indigenous community at the University of Toronto. He has a PhD in political science and is furthering his educational focus on issues within our community and the Canadian criminal justice system. Here he is.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Armand. Indeed, Canada has several issues within its institutions, though they are meant to protect the Canadian citizens. One of which is how Indigenous people account for 37% of Canada's entire prison population, despite only making up 4% of Canada's national population. Over Canada's history, the Indigenous community have been neglected by our criminal justice system, and that's only a glimpse of the harsh truth behind the Indigenous community. They have faced higher rates of victimization, especially amongst Indigenous women and men. In order for the state to conduct such information, our judicial, government, and criminal justice agencies conduct several studies on providing its existence with direct info coming from victims themselves. Now, for example, national data that exists to identify Indigenous people in the criminal justice system, for example, the General Survey, Social Survey, GSS, concerned with the topics of self-reported victimization, police-reported homicide statistics, and data on provincial and territorial and federal custody. So every 5 years, the GSS on criminal victimization presents data on Canadians aged 15 years and older, and that's basically discussing who reports having been victimized in the previous 12 months prior to this examination. Further, the survey focuses on 8 specific categories of crimes: sexual assault, robbery, physical assault, theft of personal property, breaking and entering, and evidently, with the data that's been given, it shows that Indigenous peoples have overrepresented, despite the fact that they only make up a small portion of Canada's population. Now, according to Canada's Department of Justice, Indigenous people, in particular women, are more likely to be victims of crime. In 2014, 28% of Indigenous people aged 15 plus reported being victimized in the previous 12 months compared to 18% of non-Indigenous Canadians. The rate of violent victimization among Indigenous people was definitely more than double that of non-Indigenous people. Now, as I mentioned before, Indigenous people in Canada only make up for 4% of the entire national population. And given that fact, Indigenous people accounted for 24% of all homicide victims in 2017. The homicide rate for Indigenous people was 8.76 homicides per 100,000 Indigenous population, which is 6 times higher than for non-Indigenous people. And in 2017, the homicide rate for Indigenous people increased by 8% from the previous year. Now, if there's anything that we could take away from this, it's that our criminal justice system is not entirely perfect, where many individuals and racial minorities, such as the Indigenous peoples, are neglected and discriminated against by those who are meant to protect us in the first place, and we as citizens must address these issues.
Thank you, Sarkhan. Now, considering these shocking statistics on the proportion of Indigenous Canadians in the carceral system, I turn to examine the policies and support systems in place which can help assist Indigenous persons who encounter the criminal justice system. The first system in place is the mitigating factors during sentencing. During sentencing, judges and juries will take into consideration the mitigating and aggravating factors which may be a reason to reduce or increase the severity of punishment for offenders. In the case of Indigenous persons encountering the criminal justice system, their indigeneity itself is a mitigating factor because of the damages in which colonialism has imposed upon their lives, causing colonialism to be a systemic factor, creating immense societal pressure on the Indigenous persons, which is a precursor for Indigenous persons to commit crimes. As such, indigeneity is a mitigating factor which allows for more lenient sentencing and giving Indigenous offenders a better chance of turning their lives around and ensuring that it reduces the disproportionate overrepresentation of that group within the criminal justice system. A policy in place which also reduces the involvement of Indigenous persons within the criminal justice system is called the Indigenous Justice Strategy Policy. What this policy does is it increases the involvement of Indigenous persons within the local administration of justice. The programs provide cultural alternatives to mainstream justice, with measures such as peacemaking, elders' councils, mediation, and conflict resolution. There is about 110 of these programs present across Canada, and they serve over 400 Indigenous communities. And the goal of the Indigenous Justice Strategy is to reduce the victimization and incrimination of Indigenous persons. The mandate of this program is to also help mainstream justice systems become more responsive to the needs and cultural differences of Indigenous communities. Now, considering these two policies and systems, which are meant to assist the Indigenous persons encountering the criminal justice system, it does not change the fact that there still remains a disproportionate overrepresentation of Indigenous persons that are incarcerated, and also high rates of victimization to go along with it. Moreover, as a Canadian society, we must continue to develop and reform current policies in place in order to ensure that we can create a criminal justice system which is equitable and fair for all Canadian persons, to ensure that we can continue to pride ourselves on our multicultural population. One way we can do this is through community empowerment. In many Aboriginal communities, elders and leaders are heavily respected and play an immense role in preventing breaches of the Canadian law by younger members. As such, I believe that all law enforcement officers should have ongoing classes on the history of Indigenous communities and persons. In these classes, the law enforcement actors will maintain up-to-date information on the Indigenous communities, and they will also develop relationships with the leaders of the communities so that they can have informed meetings and discussions while simultaneously developing trust with the youth of the Indigenous communities, so that when Indigenous persons do encounter the law, they are not treated unfairly, and that the law enforcement officers have a deeper, more meaningful connection with these people. Once again, thank you so much for listening to our TED Talk today, and we hope you can help join us in making a change. Thank you.